We can learn a lot from our past. The people who've gone before us, who lived life no matter how many years before, they learned lessons. Life, society's changed, but it seems like life doesn't change that much. We learn, if we are smart, if we have any degree of wisdom at all, we learn from those who've gone before us. That's why history becomes important. That's why we tell stories. That's why we remember our heritage. These stories in the Bible are important. And read some things to you this morning. And you may want to just listen, because I'm going to be pulling from several passages. The whole story spans 2 chapters, and we don't have time for all of that. So kind of just listen as I share some of this. You know the context. The people had been out on their own for about a year. In the past year, tremendous things had happened. God's displays of power should have inspired anybody to be willing to follow him. They had been released from Egyptian bondage. They had seen the 10 plagues. They had seen their protection through the Passover of the angel of death. They had parted through the waters of the Red Sea. They had been given food and manna and quail and water. They'd been protected already from enemies. They had been taken to Mount Sinai and received the 10 Commandments and seen the glory. And all that's happened in a year span of time. That's incredible. Every living person in that group had these same experiences. They have no excuse not to believe in a big God. Now they are at the edge of the promised land. They're so close they can taste it. I would imagine if the wind's flowing in the right direction, they can smell the fertile soil and the pomegranates and the grapes that were over there. In less than a year, God was ready to have them enter the promised land. They just wanted to find out what was going on. So the Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. From the tribe of Judah came Caleb, son of Jephunneh. And from the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea, he is also called Joshua, the son of Nun. When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, "Go up through the Negev and on up into the hill country. See what the land is like, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees on it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land, for it was the season of the first ripe grapes." So they went up and they explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob, and then comes several descriptions of where they went. They went through the Negev and came all the way to Hebron. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. And at the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there." Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses, and he said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. It was a frightening place to be. I remember standing there as an 8-year-old boy, toes tightly clutched to the edge, as I stood for the very first time at the edge of the high diving platform, which at that particular moment looked not 10 feet, but about 100 feet tall. I could see in the distance, the far, far distance, my friends who were watching nervously and anxiously and quite carefully to see what I would do next. And I knew that I was at a point of risk and danger. I knew that whatever I did next would bring either glory or failure to me in the eyes of my friends. My next step was going to make all the difference. I don't like comparing people to me in my life. It's pretty bad, but I'm just going to suggest that the Israelites at that moment were standing at a very similar type place. They were on the very edge. Before them was all of the promised land. Before them was all the things that God had prepared them for and had been leading them toward. They knew that it was a risky place. They knew that whatever they did next would bring either success or failure. They knew that the next step would make all the difference. 12 spies had been sent out. 12 spies had been sent to scout the land, to check on the people and the cities, and they obviously came back with a very mixed report. As the people debated among themselves what they were going to do next, the majority report of the spies was God was right. It's just as we've been promised. The land is flowing with milk and honey. It's a great place. Anybody who lives there ought to be able to survive and thrive. The fruit is luscious. Look at how big these grapes are. It's a great place that God told us about. He just didn't tell us everything. The cities are walled and heavily fortified. The people are fierce. They're ferocious. And they're big too. Well, compared to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and we looked the same to them as well. I think we should back off. I think we should turn around. It was at that moment that two of the 12 spoke up and said, "Well, let me give you the minority report." Joshua and Caleb were the only two who begged to differ. They said, "We can do this. If God is with us, we can step out. Don't fear them. For our God is bigger than they are." Sadly, the people refused to believe. That night, chapter 14, all the people in the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt, or at least in this desert. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it have been better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "We should choose another leader and go back to Egypt. Caleb and Joshua tried one more time. If the Lord's pleased with us, He will lead us to that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and He will give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord. And don't be afraid of the people of the land. Their protection is gone. The Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. This story is really an important story in the history and the life of the people. Because at that moment, standing on the edge, the people listened to the majority. They listened to their common sense. They listened to reason. They looked out and they said, those obstacles, those giants, they're huge. And they backed off. Instead of trusting God, they backed away. For 40 years, the Israelites would wander in circles. For 40 years, they would be doomed to wander in that wilderness, always closer than they thought, always closer to that promised land. For 40 years, a generation would die. Of the people living that day, the people made their choice. Only Joshua and Caleb would enter that promised land, old men by that point. They looked out, they saw giants, and in spite of what God had done, they said, we can't go forward. Friends, I want to ask us today about ourselves. And I just want you to kind of place yourself, if you can, in this story. So I want you to be thinking, is there any similarity between what was going on here and your life, or we could even say this congregation? Have you come at any point right to the very edge of God's promises, of God's glory, of the life that God wants for you? Have you ever come right to the edge of a life of total obedience to God? Only to find that the giants were too big, the place was too scary, the challenges seemed too great, only to back off. As you look back over your life, and you can think, I think you can think about the congregation as well. Let me ask it another way. As you look back over your life, however long you have been following Christ, however long you've been a Christian, have you been moving forward? Have you been growing? Have you been challenged, or have you been going in circles? Never really moving, never really changing. Have you let your life be ruled by fear or unbelief or complacency? That's a danger that I see as a pastor so many Christians fall into. That is the place of danger I see so many churches fall into. They face some very real giants, and I want to give them some names today. I want to suggest that those same giants are here today, and if we don't face and address them and defeat them in the name of the Lord, as Christians, most of us are doomed to circle. Never really growing, never reaching the potential, never tasting all that God has in store for us here. The first giant I want to suggest, and these in my mind come right out of this story. The first giant is the giant of unbelief, and it's a big one. Those Israelites had every reason to believe in a big God. They had seen His displays of power in ways you and I can't, we can barely at best imagine. And yet when the moment came, and they were ready to step in the promised land, they said, even though we've got a God who can part waters, who can provide food, who can protect us from enemies, who can deliver us from Egypt, we don't think He can take care of giants. And we're not going forward. I see that so often. People who begin to wrestle with The thought that maybe God is calling us in new directions or to reach out in new ways to new people, to do something that might seem a little different. Or people who are saying, in my own life, I'm not sure. I think I need to change job, change where I live, change something. But I'm afraid. And I know God has taken care of people in the past, and I know He's taken care of me. But I've never faced these challenges before. They're too big. And so churches and people, we back off. And we miss an opportunity. I'll tell you that giant of unbelief is a big one. And it's real. But there's also a giant of fear that goes on. And I think that giant was very real. In the life of the Israelites. They looked out, but when those 10 spies looked, they saw obstacles. They saw problems. They forgot to look back and see God. And so they were more afraid of what was ahead than excited about it. Even though God was clearly moving them, clearly with them, clearly pushing them on, they were more afraid of the obstacles and the giants than they were of the grace and the power of God. Their eyes had been blinded. And because they were only fixating on the problems and the challenges and the changes, they began to compare those with their own, or against their own abilities and needs, and they came up short. We're like grasshoppers. We can't do this. Only Caleb and Joshua looked at this from a totally different perspective. They said, "No, wait a minute. There are problems. There are challenges. Those people are real. The walls are real. We're not negating that. We've got to be realistic. But you forgot our big God, and against our big God, it's those giants who are grasshoppers. We can do this if we have courage." How many times I've seen people, and I've done it too. When we feel called to move in a new direction, we get afraid. The hardest thing to do is to change. Change always brings risk. It always brings discomfort. If I told every one of you who are on the back row that next week I expect you to sit up front, if I told every one of you that love this section, that next week you have to sit on this side, just that little bit of change would overwhelm some of you. I've seen it happen. These are big changes. It happens. And we get afraid. Fear and unbelief can paralyze any one of us, can paralyze the church. But let me add one more. And this one I found, and I think it's in our culture, is probably the biggest giant of them all. It's the giant of complacency. If you want to call it the giant of comfort, that'll work for me as well. You've got the giant of unbelief, and sometimes in the midst of change, sometimes when we're being challenged by new ideas, new directions, we find how little we really trust God. Sometimes we find out how fearful we really are, and sometimes we find out just how comfortable we are. And here's where I find that we Christians and we churches really, really bog down. Those 10 spies looked out and they saw and they gave the report back to the Israelites, and all of them said, "Hey, we were better off in Egypt." Remember that passage I said? Why did we ever leave Egypt to come into this desert in the first place? And what are we thinking? At least we've had a year. We've learned how to build fires and cook food for ourselves. We can manage over here just fine. And on this side, why would we ever want to face these giants? Why would we want to get into these battles that are up ahead? Why would we want to do that? It's so much easier and it's so much safer right where we are. Have you ever heard yourself say that? Have you ever said, but preacher, we like it this way. But preacher, this is what we're used to. But Jim, I'm comfortable with this. I know what to expect. I know how to act. We haven't done it that way before because we don't need to do it that way before. And so we go in circles. And we go in circles, and 40 years later you can look and say we're remarkably the same. We look the same, we act the same, we dress the same, we think the same. The world's changed, but we haven't. We're strong. We forget, and we're behind. We're not in the promised land. I see the people, I see individuals. Preacher, I don't know why I didn't take that job years ago. I don't know why I didn't do this. I don't know why I didn't pursue that dream. I felt like God was calling me in this direction. I didn't do it because I was safe and it was comfortable. And 40 years later, we're asking the same questions. Why didn't I do it? Why didn't I step out when I could have? This happened thousands of years ago. And yet the story is as real and fresh as ever. It's just the story of life. People looked out and they saw problems and forgot the big God. We look like grasshoppers in our own eyes. Friends, I just want to say that God is as big as ever, and He still touches us. And if you're feeling called out in a new direction, if you're feeling like there's a decision that you've just been afraid to make, if you're called, if you feel the tug of God's Spirit, and you say, VBS, are you kidding me? I can't work with kids, and yet you feel that little tug, answer it, do it, go for it. How will you ever know what's ahead if you don't take the step? By the way, that day long ago when I was 8 years old, I didn't jump. It was a whole lot easier to back off. The giant was way too tall. I squandered a small chance for victory. And as I think about that sense, I've got to hope that were I there today, I'd do different. That I'd take the plunge and step out. Because the life that God wants is in front of me, not behind. Let's learn from Caleb and Joshua. In fact, instead of a closing hymn today, and I'll have a prayer in a minute, I want you to hear from a couple of people who've done exactly that, who faced some fears. They didn't know I was going to introduce them this way, who faced some challenges, who faced unbelief, who faced complacency, and said, we're willing to step out in faith. I want to invite the Sykes to come and close us with a word.